Hi, ladies and gentlemen. This is Jerry Kroth, a professor in California. This is a pretty dark background that you see because this is a pretty dark talk. I was going to make this talk about 3 or 4 months ago and said to myself, I do not want to do this. I have 2 daughters. I do not want to paint a picture of their future, which is this bleak. And so I waited. I saw more data coming in, and as much as I don't want this to be true, I think it might be. And so I'm presenting you a, a lecture on the global collapse caused by the coronavirus and what it triggers. All right? And I hope that it's not true. I'm making this video on September 2020, and a year from now, I will be very, very happy to say, it wasn't true. I'm so glad it didn't come to pass. But I think the odds are against that. So get ready for this and buckle up. This is a talk that comes in 2 parts. The first part is called When a Black Swan Flies Over a House of Cards. So a distinguished professor wrote a book called The Black Swan. There are lots of white swans, and black swans are extremely rare in nature. So he said a black swan event in the economy is something that's completely unexpected, that comes out of nowhere. Well, in December of 2019 and January of 2020, things were rosy, we thought. The markets were up. Unemployment was at its lowest level in almost 40 years. And then COVID came. COVID-19 is the black swan, unpredicted event. But this is not about COVID. This is about a house of cards. COVID triggers something. There were pre-existing conditions to this patient that are going to cause this collapse. So part 1 of this talk, I actually did an article on February 10th entitled When a Black Swan Flies Over a House of Cards. That was about 1 month before the market tanked, but it's since recovered. So this talk is all about the House of Cards, and the House of Cards has 3 weak spots, as it were. The first is global debt, the second is American fragility, and the third is what I call derivatives chaos. Add these 3 pre-existing conditions to the COVID-19 trigger, and what you have is a house of cards that is collapsing. So this talk is about the next 4 to 8 years of your life. And I would like it to be a rosy picture, but I think it's going to be quite the opposite. This tells you what it is, why it is, how it is happening. This is not, most of my videos are not about mainstream topics. This is not Anderson Cooper. I tend to make videos about things where you unmask the truth, whether it's propaganda or the Kennedy assassination or whatever. So this is in that tradition. So we begin the House of Cards by talking about global debt. So we now have globally $255 trillion worth of debt. 2008 financial crisis, which was caused a lot by debt, mortgage debt, that there would be some kind of regulation, that things would have gotten under control. We really didn't learn our lesson. The total amount of debt has gone up and gone up and gone up every single year, almost doubling since 2008. It equals currently $32,000 for every person on Earth. Okay, we basically incurred more debt in order to get out of that crisis. Now, the total package of debt globally, the United States has the most. China's next, Japan's next, France is next, so forth. So the theory here, and our first peg of the first weakness in the House of Cards, is that since 2008, low interest rates, easy money, accumulating debt created bubbles. COVID-19 pricks the bubble, okay? A New York Times article, this is how the coronavirus will destroy the economy. That's coming from the New York Times. Here's what the guy said, in blue. But the largest and most risky pools of debt have shifted from households and banks in the United States, which were restrained by regulators after the crisis, to corporations all over the world. So it's metastasized. It's gone global. This guy most of the people I cite in this video are pretty expert folks. This is not a garage band kind of YouTube video saying buy Bitcoin or gold. That's not what this is, okay? Everybody in this video is a PhD or an economist or well-respected in some. These are pretty big authorities you're going to hear, and there are dozens of them. Yanis Varoufakis is Greek, I believe. He said something I like. He said, if you go to a bank and borrow $10,000 and then you lose your job, you're in trouble. But if you borrowed $1 million and then you lose your job, the bank is in trouble. Well, that's really the situation that has happened now. Banks are in trouble. The debt creates a bubble. The virus pricks the bubble.
Covid-19 has pricked the bubble on which financial capitalism was sitting up until now.
So, here's a very interesting video of how the debt plus the bubble plus the 1% all mix together to create a pretty disastrous situation. It's worth your time.
4 decades of central bank monetary manipulation, lower and lower interest rates, and free money have all flowed to the very top. According to Forbes magazine, the top 20 people in the world are worth $1.31 trillion. According to the Federal Reserve, the bottom 3.75 billion people are worth $1.3 trillion. Which means that 20 people in the world are worth the bottom half of the world combined. If these numbers don't scare you, they should. They represent an unsustainable math problem. We have seen this movie before. In 1929, easy monetary policies had pushed wealth into the hands of just a few. The wealth gap was the largest in human history. It led to anger, which led to the election of populist leaders. These leaders adopt policies of nationalism and tariffs. That easy money led to massive asset bubbles. The Roaring Twenties saw stocks quadruple. The Warren Buffett indicator, which measures the market cap to GDP ratio, hit 141% in 1929. The signs today are exactly the same. Today, the Warren Buffett indicator is at 155%.
So, that's a very instructive little video. Now, I have gathered together some soothsayers. I call them soothsayers, who were talking about global debt as a huge problem before anyone ever heard of the Black Swan, the COVID-19 virus. Okay? So these people are going to get silver medals in my economics Olympics because they were talking about this problem before the trigger event happened. Here's the IMF, which was talking about corporate debts and how dangerous they are. And it said, the IMF warns that 40% of all corporate debt in major economies could be considered at risk in another global downturn. Well, that was before there was a global downturn. This guy is named Jim Rogers. Very interesting fella. And here he talks before this talk was made a couple months before COVID appeared.
And I'll start watching.
And how big a crash could we be looking at?
It's going to be the worst in your lifetime.
I've had some pretty big ones in my lifetime. It's long.
It's going to be the biggest in my lifetime, and I'm older than you. No. You know, in 2008, we had a problem because of debt. Henry, The debt now, that debt was nothing compared to what's happening now. In 2008, the Chinese had a lot of money saved for a rainy day. It started raining, they started spending the money. Now even the Chinese have debt, and the debt is so much higher. The Federal Reserve, the central bank in America, balance sheet is up over 5 times since 2008. It's going to be the worst in my lifetime too. Be worried.
So now these people are not prophets. This guy, Gerald Salent, he's made a number of wrong predictions. A few of them made wrong predictions, but these seem to be very, very correct, though. He's talking now about European Union debt. And here's what he has to say. And this is recorded before anybody knew anything about COVID.
And as far as Italy goes, they haven't recovered from the panic of '08. They're still way down deep in the depths, and their debt to GDP ratio is the highest among any, way above the other European countries. So there's no way out. And they're going to increase their debt regardless of what the ECB does. The global economy is going down. They're all injecting monetary methadone into it to keep the artificially addicted bull running.
So,
pretty strong language, but prescient as well. This guy's named Ray Dalio. He is the head of the world's largest hedge fund. People have a great deal of respect for him. I think it was October, before the virus, he said, things look a lot like the Great Depression is coming. Peter Schiff predicted the 2008 crash. He also predicted a lot of things that didn't happen. But here he is talking about the collapsing global economy and the American economy a couple months before the virus.
Okay, dollars in decline. Dow's setting new records. Gold's in a decent zone. You turn on Fox Business, you'd think we're in the roaring 20s. Some tells me that that's not how you see it.
Well, you know, the roaring 20s didn't actually end very well, right? Because we had the stock market crash and the Great Depression. So in that sense, maybe they're right, except it's not the early 1920s, it's the late 1920s. But also the U.S. economy is in much worse shape than it was in the 1920s. So what we're heading for is going to be something much, much worse than the Depression. In fact...
Okay, so Peter Schiff is just one of many here. This is Forbes magazine writing in... I don't have the exact date, but it's before the crisis. It is December, okay, December 3rd. So this is a month and a half before. Talking about the Second Great Depression.
I think the world economy is now plunging into an unprecedented deflation, recession, period of shrinkage. That will bring down all the markets around the world that have been vastly overvalued as a result of this massive money printing and liquidity flow into the Wall Street and other financial markets.
We have one more. Robert Prechter, he comes at it from the point of cycles, but he writes a book called Conquering the Crash of 2020. And most of that book is written before you ever heard of the COVID crisis. But this guy is going to get my gold medal. He's a professor of economics. He's talking about a coming collapse, and he never heard of COVID. So he gets the gold.
Overdue. And all of my economic colleagues, right-wingers, left-wingers, and those in the middle, we all know it's coming. And therefore, 2020 or 2021, you can bet much that there will be an economic downturn. And I have to tell you, even though I don't want to scare anybody, that this one is really likely to be bad, and for a simple reason. To react to the great crash of 2008 and 9, the Federal Reserve, as other central banks, cut interest rates, as you know, to historic lows, even going negative sometimes. It meant that money could be borrowed at virtually no cost. And every corporation, every government, and many people borrowed money because it was so cheap, which means that the level of indebtedness, government, corporate, and private, individual, is higher than we have ever seen it. You put together a likely downturn with overload of debt, and you have a recipe for very serious economic problems.
There we go. So he's my gold medal winner. Now let's take all these guys that we've cited, I'm sure there are many more, And say, what do they have in common? Well, they're basically all saying one thing. Easy money creates global debt that expands, inexorably rising and leading to the collapse of the global economy. And now, there's a statistic called the debt to GDP ratio. Now, let me explain. Here's how much you produce right here, and here's how much debt you have, okay? You earn $50,000 a year and you have $50,000 in debt. Well, the debt to GDP ratio means that you owe way more than you produce. Can you see that? So it keeps rising. That ratio keeps rising until it ultimately explodes. And we are right on the cusp of that explosion. And we were on that cusp before COVID appeared. Yes, we could say, well, Jerry, the market did crash, but look, it's all over. The Dow Jones went down, and then the Dow Jones came back, and it erases all of its losses. The stock market reaches a new high. S&P 500 turns positive. The stock market erases all of its losses. Everybody's happy. It's September 2020. Ha ha. It's all over? Is it really all over? That fast? That's the question of this talk. So global markets, by the way, are paralleling the United States market. That's South Korea, V-shaped recovery. Germany, V-shaped recovery. US, V-shaped recovery. Oh my God, isn't this wonderful? So the question is, how did this happen so fast? We hear about unemployment and the virus is still raging. How does that happen? Well, one of the major factors is that we have printed our way out of it. That's the NASDAQ. And below is a graph of how much money the Federal Reserve has been printing in red. You see the red line? It goes up. We printed at least $3 trillion, and that's pushing the markets up. The markets are flooded with cash that the Federal Reserve has created. Scott Pelley interviewed Jerome Powell, the head of the Federal Reserve, and said, where does this money come from? And Jerome Powell said, we just printed.
Simply flooded the system with money.
Yes, we did. That's another way to think about it. We did.
Where does it come from? Do you just print it?
We print it digitally. So we as a central bank, we have the ability to create money digitally.
Yeah. So we've printed our way out of the crisis. Successfully, I guess. U.S. printed about $3 trillion, as much as we can determine. We can't really know that for sure. Japan seems to have printed $2.2 trillion. The EU seems to have printed $1 trillion. China seems to have printed $0.4 trillion. That's $6.24 trillion, but it's only $6.24 trillion out of the $255 trillion that could possibly default. So only 2% or 2.5% actually of the global debt has been printed away. There's still a lot more waiting there. So the question comes to this: is that enough money printing to prevent bankruptcies and defaults? In June, U.S. bankruptcy filings were up 48%. Not good. In July, commercial bankruptcies were up 43%. Here's a little video on bankruptcies.
The COVID-19 pandemic has throttled economic activity and dragged down corporate profits, and as the disease has spread, a cascade of bankruptcies has followed, with no end in sight. The prognosis is grim for many companies and entire industries, not to mention for investors caught in an outbreak of distress.
I do think people are going to have to be patient, and people are going to have to be creative.
Meanwhile, governments and central banks are pulling out all the stops to slow the torrent of red ink.
That has distorted normal recessionary dynamics, and again, postponed many of the credit consequences which we're likely to see over the longer term.
This guy is asked, he's a really well-respected person on Wall Street. He's asked, what is the biggest threat we face? This is August of 20.
I think, Wilfred, what derails this market isn't more China-US tension, isn't more political difference is it would be if we get them large-scale bankruptcies. That is what derails this market. Otherwise, you have a very strong technical supporting this marketplace.
And has slightly plateauing or improving data as it relates to the virus made you feel like those bankruptcies may be held off or not?
No, unfortunately not. I think the damage done to the economy is large. I don't think that just simply leveling off in GDP growth is going to make us avoid a couple of things that I'm really worried about: long-term unemployment, and on the other hand, a series of capital impairment corporate events, bankruptcies.
So this is another PhD economist named Diane Swank talking about the same subject. I hope I'm not overwhelming you with expert opinion, but this is your life. This is your future. This is my future. And I thought the more evidence we can bring to bear of people who we would otherwise listen to, people we respect, and so there are just a couple more here to make this first point about global debt.
Losses. You can't, as a business, you can maybe get a loan to defer the fact that you don't have cash coming in the door for a little bit, although many businesses are shutting down. But for a family, especially for households in the Black and Hispanic community, this is just insult to injury. It's leaving people without money at a critical time and leaving them on the streets. We're talking about food insecurity and homelessness, the likes of which we've not seen since the Great Depression. Dissonance is really getting to be deafening between the financial markets, Wall Street and Main Street. And I think one of the things the financial markets aren't taking into account is the compounding effect that this is having. We're talking about an economy where you're shuttering a lot of businesses. At least 500,000 businesses have shut down permanently at this point in time in the U.S.
So we're talking about global debt here, not just U.S. debt. So let's move our perception to the global situation. China expects a 20% surge in bankruptcies. Brazil expects a 45% surge. Britain expects a 43% surge. Spain expects a 41% increase. Remember what Varoufakis said. If you borrowed $1 million from a bank and you lose your job, the bank is left holding the bag. So Sheila Bair from Volcker Alliance says that banks may be on the verge of collapse. And add into this the level of unemployment today and what happens if there's a second wave. Yeah, that's a projection for the fourth quarter, the fall of this year. What would happen if we had a second outbreak? And that's the first quarter of 2021 unemployment levels. They're enormous. So global unemployment is expected to worsen if there is a second wave. Economists foresee an unemployment tsunami coming. Mark Zandi, chief economist of Moody's, pretty prestigious position, don't you think? August 2020 says a real tsunami is coming. Okay? So the global debt has hit 331% of GDP. A global debt crisis is looming, writes Joseph Stiglitz, a Nobel Prize winning economist. This is August 2020. Okay? So these are very respected people who are saying pretty much the same thing. This is Martin Wolf. I'm promising my parade of experts is coming to an end. So bear with me. One more, Martin Wolf, British economist who writes for the Financial Times.
It's affecting every economy in the world, including China, of course, and all the emerging and developing countries, as well as the developed countries. If you think we're now in 1930, as it were, we're going over a cliff faster than in 1930. It's more global than in 1930.
So let me explain how this unravels from my knowledge of how I'm operating. I'm a psychologist, so I'm not an economist. I'm doing this as a scientific journalist, gathering this information. So here's the evolution of this process. First, we have a coronavirus, the Black Swan trigger, which leads to an economy shutting down, trying to reopen, shutting down, trying to reopen. That leads to widespread unemployment. And widespread unemployment leads to people who cannot pay their debts. Okay, they cannot pay their mortgages or their rent. And that is the point where usually starvation, civil unrest, and looting occur. But that hasn't happened because of money printing, stimulus checks, unemployment checks, which can't last forever. Now, the next step are a series of steps that happen rather rapidly. First, the debt bubble bursts, corporations default, countries default, banks collapse, and global worldwide depression ensues. And that happens rapidly. We're right at that cusp as we speak. So the reality is, in September 2020, the global debt has not passed that tipping point yet. We don't have any major bank collapses. Okay, so that is the place we're at presently. Okay, in our house of cards. But remember, the house of cards is made up of 3 weak spots. We just talked about one, global debt. There are 2 more to consider. So we return to our original picture of our Black Swan flying over a house of cards, and we talked about 3 weaknesses. First is global debt, which we just covered, which is a pre-existing condition, really. The second is American fragility, and the third is derivatives chaos. Okay, add those 3 together, and that creates the weak spots for the house of cards. All right. So let's now talk about the house of cards. Here we're exploring a little more propaganda, delusion, and denial, which is part of my book. I'll get to that later. We have a lot of propaganda on this score. The U.S. fundamentals remain strong, says Jerome Powell. Farmland partner says the economy is strong. The fundamentals of the market are strong. The fundamentals are still strong. Goldman Sachs says it's going to be great next year. U.S. economic outlook for 2020 on firmer ground. Hard data says the economy is just fine. Trump touts the fantastic economy in June of this year. Now, I wrote a book called Implosion, and some people thought it was about 9/11. And no, it's called, the subtitle is Delusion, Denial, and the Prospect of Collapse. Okay, it's about America's collapse and implosion. And in this book, which is a couple of years old, I updated it for this talk, but I took a look at 2 scholars. Jared Diamond, a noted anthropologist from UCLA, wrote a book called Guns, Germs, and Steel, but he also wrote a book called Collapse. Got less attention, got my attention. What causes societies to collapse? Arnold Toynbee, a historian, also wrote about what caused societies to collapse. And between the 2 of them, there are 7 major factors that join together. For example, natural disasters. The Mayans may have collapsed because of drought. The Minoan civilization appears to have collapsed because of a volcano. Natural disasters have caused civilizations to collapse. They also talk about modern civilizations too, like the Soviet Union. The empire gets overextended. The family structure disintegrates, and the protection of children weakens. There's a sign of perverse and bizarre entertainment. Think of the Roman Colosseum. There's a parasitic elite that emerges. War, violence, and crime come out. And then there's debt and a debased currency. Those things cause collapse. So I wanted to find out, if that was a report card, how does America score? That was my interest, okay? And I actually did this. So I'm not going to bore you regurgitating this whole book. I want to give you a feeling, though, for what we're talking about. Like, how do we score on natural disasters? Here are the total. Let's take a look at 2019's natural disasters. This is a short movie. Does that threaten the United States of America? Does it threaten a collapse of our country? Doesn't seem that big to me. I actually live in California right now, and we have fires, and there's a major fire about 15 miles from our house. Smoke outside, and our cars are packed with all of our belongings. And we had an evacuation warning, and it's been lifted. That's just a personal anecdote here. So let's take a look at the cost of natural disasters over time. Well, they did go up, didn't they? From 1970 to 2019, I mean, they went up way more than population went up. Well, but the question is this enough to destroy the United States of America? I don't think so. But I'd say we probably score B- on this one of these 7 factors. It's not horrible, but it's getting worse, that's for sure. I skipped one, but this is megatrend number 3, the disintegrating family. I thought, how do you measure the incidence of a disintegrating family? And I pondered, I said maybe we should use divorce statistics. And then I thought, no, a better statistic would be the number of children born to single mothers. Well, that shows, that makes you go, oh my God, okay? So from 1970 to 2019, it has increased over 3 times. 42% of American children are not being raised in traditional nuclear families. Okay, I thought that was awfully high. Is that a measure of societal collapse or potential societal collapse? Well, we have a propaganda machine, and in which we have a lot of articles saying, oh, single motherhood is great. Try it sometime. 31 reasons being a single mom is awesome. Well, if you've got a good job, I suppose that is true. But I wanted to look into this to see how generalized that idea is. And I discovered there are 3 groups here. There are wealthier people who want to be single parents. There's a middle group of single moms who are actually living with a boyfriend, but they're not married. And then I think the largest group are poor people who have been deserted and abandoned. There are 3 million fathers in the United States, for example, who are delinquent on child support payments. That's a measure of a disintegrating family structure, anthropologically. So the statistics are not appealing in this group. As a group, forget about the 3 subgroups. As a single group, the graduates of single-parent families do not look very good. They suffer more addictions, more abuse, twice as likely to become alcoholic, graduate from high school less frequently, 5 times more likely to commit suicide, 5 times more likely to be incarcerated, 14 times more likely to commit rape, 30 times more likely to become homeless. Those are correlates of poverty as well as correlates of single-parent families. So, cross-culturally, it's a different picture. Not every culture has the same attitude that we have about single parents. In China, 1% of children are born to single-parent families. In Japan, it's 2%. There is a stigma associated with being a single parent. In America, it's 42%. So it's a pathological trend. I say we get our score, I think, is a D- on this. All right, on our report card. Now, perverse and bizarre entertainment and society's obligation to protect children is a correlate to societal collapse. So I'm going to actually quote myself now. This is a previous video I made, short little tiny clip, quoting myself. A teacher in Mississippi showed a clip of 50 Shades of Grey. They were fired. A sex education teacher showed a movie in Indiana of a very scientific, very dry, educational movie about masturbation to his sex education class. Fired. Clearly, so the school system takes a rather conservative role in the protection of children. Okay? However, before we get to that, I want to imagine a situation, guided fantasy, a 6th grade teacher teaching sex education in junior high school decides that he's going to invite a 13-year-old prostitute to come and talk to his class. And the next day, he's going to invite another girl to come to talk to his class who was paid $500 to have sex. Now, do you think that teacher is going to last very long in that school system? All right. No. The answer is no. All right. However, there's another classroom that kids come home to after school, the classrooms of Jerry Springer, classrooms of Maury Povich, Geraldo Rivera, Ricky Lake of old, even Oprah Winfrey when she got started. There are others. This is called trash TV. So here is a snippet from a 3 o'clock in the afternoon network television program, Maury Povich.
Will jail turn Joyce around? Michelle's teen terror had sex in a church trying to get pregnant. It gets worse.
Men pay me to have sex.
Will jail change Erica? Tracy's 14-year-old does dangerous things to try to have a baby.
I got paid $500 just to have sex.
So Maury fashions himself as a social worker, okay? That because he brings out these people and then he sends them off to boot camp and he says, oh, isn't this terrible? But he has them dress up, scantily clad, swear into the television camera. He's a circus barker, okay, on afternoon TV. If he was a school teacher, he would have been fired and probably put in prison for child endangerment. But he masquerades as a social worker. Okay, that's the only part I wanted to quote from my past lecture, but a professional social worker has certain differences from the Maury Povich show. For example, if you're a social worker and you have a child who's acting out and you're having a case conference about whether or not this child should be placed in a boot camp or a rehabilitation facility of some sort, you don't have the child come to that clinical conference dressed in a brassiere, okay? Or you don't have the child pose in this manner for the camera. That would be malpractice for a social worker to do that. Okay? This is not social work. This is exploitation. Now, there are many other elements here. Children see models. If a movie actor is smoking, children tend to smoke. Hollywood's noticed that. Behaviorists have known about it for 50 years. But Hollywood said maybe we should cut down on smoking in movies. But there are many, many other examples of how imitative behavior takes shape.
Actor and regularly goes on benders, abuses various substances, and generally aims for rock bottom. It may be funny, but it's sometimes a scary reality for...
This is much more contemporary, a video series called 13 Reasons Why. It's about a teenager who commits suicide, and it explores the teenager's feelings and of depression and so forth. Well, if you look at the data, a study found that suicide among teens increased 13.3% after this show was released. It's a very interesting correlation. So imitative learning and the media has changed radically towards violence and more violence and violent video games. And one of the consequences, according to the American Psychological Association, is an increase in actual violence. In 10 years, there have been 180 school shootings, 356 victims. Okay? So perverse and bizarre entertainment is a symptom of a collapsing society. So say our scholars. Let's take a look at megatrend number 5, a parasitic elite emerges. Okay? When I say megatrend 5, I'm talking about those 7 factors that cause social collapse. So the Romanovs, for example, the Tsar had accumulated a fortune of $300 billion. I mean, he was wealthier than Bill Gates is today. And the Russian peasantry earned about $1,500 a year, and they said, enough is enough. And the communist revolution took over, and that was the end of centuries of czarist rule. In France, Louis XVI moved his government to Versailles, and 15,000 princes and sycophants came, in their dress to govern France in the most opulent surroundings. The French people, Les Miserables at the time, didn't like it, and Marie Antoinette was decapitated in the guillotine. End of that era, and social collapse. Here comes Bernie Sanders.
Bring out on the table what income and wealth inequality means to this country, not vague terms. As a nation, are we satisfied with the reality that today the top 1/10 of 1%, not 1%, 1/10 of 1% owns almost as much wealth as the bottom 90%? Are we satisfied that in the last 4 decades there has been a massive shift of wealth from the middle class to the top 1%? Are we satisfied that in America today, the 3 wealthiest people in this country, Bill Gates, Jeff Bezos, and Warren Buffett, now own more wealth than the bottom half of America, that is 160 million people?
So let's take a look at graphing quantitatively, which is what I was trying to do here, the top 1%. And you can see that the percentage of wealth now held by the 1% is greater than it was in the roaring 20s, right at the cusp of the crash of 1929. Nancy Pelosi is worth $120 million, according to one source. That makes her 1,200 times wealthier than the average family that she represents. Dianne Feinstein is worth $50 million. This guy wanted to be president. He's worth $56 billion. This guy is president. He's worth $3 billion. This guy is worth $20 million. Okay? Nancy Pelosi's estate, she has a couple, this is her winery in Northern California. This is her home in San Francisco. I read some real estate publication that said her home may be the most expensive home in San Francisco. This is the home of Dianne Feinstein. Okay? This is the home of a senator who is worth $500 million. This is the home of Mitch McConnell. This is the home of Kamala Harris in Brentwood, California, right butting up next to Beverly Hills. And you would think this is a picture of Versailles, but this is Donald Trump's living room in his New York apartments, I guess. So half of all the U.S. senators are millionaires. There are 20 millionaires representing the people of California. There are now 70 millionaires in the Florida House and Senate. So what do you call this? It's not a democracy. It's called a plutocracy, the government by the wealthy. And that's reality. Okay? The greater the concentration of wealth in the top echelon of society and government, the closer to perfect. So, by the way, that's Bernie Sanders' house in Vermont. Kind of modest, I would imagine. So, there is one last factor for this picture of American fragility, which is called the debt bomb. This is not global debt. This is American debt. All right? So we're going to just focus in on the American debt picture. Have we been chastised? After all, we caused the recession of 2008. It was our mortgage banking crisis that caused it. So did we change? This is credit card debt since 2008. It is now $1 trillion. I don't see any reform here, do you? This is student debt since 2008. It has more than doubled and is now $1.4 trillion. I don't see any changes here. This is auto loan debt since 2008, since 2010. It pretty much doubles. This is corporate debt that just continues to expand. $10 trillion, easy money, low interest rates. This is public debt, cities, states, municipalities. I don't know if it's doubled. I'd say it's pretty close. And here's an interesting video by a professor a couple of years ago I thought this was amusing. I think it's worth your time.
In debt is the US government. Let's put the numbers in perspective. If we stacked up individual $100 bills, $100 million would look like this. If we added up the annual incomes of everyone in the top 1%, they would total about $2 trillion. That's 20,000 pallets of $100 million each. This is the total value of all assets the US government currently owns, about $3 trillion. In 2015, the federal government collected $3.2 trillion in taxes and spent $3.8 trillion. The government had to borrow the difference, which brought its total debt at the end of 2015 to $19 trillion. For comparison, the annual output of the whole US economy is only $18 trillion in it.
So, in sum, that debt that we have is also at a tipping point. Okay, so if we summarize now our natural disasters, the 7 factors that we've reviewed, we skipped a couple, add it all up, and our report card is F+, okay, D- to F+. Now, I actually quantified this. I teach research methods I taught research methods and statistics at my university, and I worked with a statistician. I said, I want all these 7 factors to be scaled into one line. Okay, let's call it the American Dystopia Index. It's the yellow line. So all of those 7 factors are represented by that yellow line, and the green line is population. So you can see that we were pretty together until 1990, and then things started to explode and get out of control. Okay, those 7 factors, in disintegrating families, or overextended empire, violence, and all those things, added into one simple quantitative measure. Our report card is very bad. Now, I wanted to bring that up to date for this talk. So here it is right up to 2019, and guess what? It's grown 23% since 2015. We're not getting better. We're getting worse. Now, I think I say to myself, people don't understand this quantitative approach that you're making. Let's create a metaphor to try to explain it better. Well, imagine that this is the United States of America. This is a patient, okay? And that's his medical chart. And that yellow line represents his cholesterol, his drinking habits, his exercise habits, his relationships, his metabolism, glucose scores, all one risk number. And the green line is what is normal, and the yellow line is out of control. So this guy is obviously out of control. All right? Now, here's a question for you. If you were asked to invest your life savings in this man being alive 10 years from today, would you do it? Well, when you decide to put your money in a money market fund or a bond fund over the course of 10 years, that's exactly what you're doing. You're assuming the United States is going to be fine 10 years from now. Is that patient going to be alive 10 years from now? I was on a radio show about 1.5 years ago. I forgot the name of the radio. They interviewed me, and the guy said we knew about my American Dystopia Index. And he said he had interviewed Jared Diamond the week before, the anthropologist. He asked Jared Diamond a question: how many years before the United States collapses? Jared Diamond said, I'd give it 10 years or less. So he asked me the same question. I don't know if Jared Diamond actually said that, but this is what the radio announcer said to me. And I said, I don't want to give a date. I don't have a date. I don't do those kind of things. All I can do is say that the risk factors are very, very high right now and growing. So there's our house of cards. There's COVID, the Black Swan, and we have global debt as a weakness. We have American fragility, F+, as a weakness. And now we have a third weakness, which is called derivatives chaos, which we're going to talk about next. All right? Those 3 things are the weak spots of the house of cards, which COVID triggers. So let's now take a look at what I call derivatives chaos. And this is, I saved the most abstract one for the last because really important, but it's kind of hard to explain. So I'll make it quick and I'll make it direct. So first, here's what a derivative is. It is a contract between two or more parties whose value is based on an underlying asset somewhere else. Okay, and they have names for things that are just, they cause you anxiety. Mortgage-backed securities, credit default swaps, total return swaps, CDSs, credit spread for, lots of these things. These are things that Wall Street has managed to package and sell as securities. So the MBS, the mortgage-backed security, is what caused the recession of 2008. Now, here's a fellow who I found really made a cogent description of a credit default swap. And you can kind of generalize from that other things about derivatives. So listen to this. It's worth 1.5 minutes of your time. It's a very good explanation.
Have you ever wondered about credit default swaps? Didn't think so, but we're going to talk about them anyway. Now, this little demonstration illustrates the concept of asset-backed credit default swaps, but it's not exact. I'm taking a little creative license here to make the point. So, here goes. A person buys a house. I know this is a barn, but again, creative license. So the homeowner gets a mortgage from the bank and uses it to buy the house. The homeowner pays the bank dutifully every month. Little principal, little interest, little principal, little interest. Now, the bank might start to get a little antsy because this homeowner's credit might not be so great. She might lose her job. She might stop paying on the loan at some point, and the bank wants to make sure they get their money. So here's where an insurance company or other large financial institution might step in and say, hey there, bank, how about if we sell you this credit default swap? If Susie homeowner defaults on her mortgage, we'll guarantee to pay it off ourselves. Well, that sounds great to the bank, so they make the deal. And now, when the homeowner makes her mortgage payment each month, the bank gives a little bit of the interest to the insurance company in payment for the credit default swap's guarantee. The bank's profit is a little bit lower, but that's okay because their risk is lower too. So, what could possibly go wrong here? Well, what if there were trillions of dollars in credit default swap arrangements covering all kinds of bonds and other debt? And what if just a few giant financial firms were on the hook for all that money? And what if they didn't have enough capital set aside to cover themselves if the economy fell apart? And then, what if the economy fell apart? Of course, that's exactly what happened in 2008. And of course, the American taxpayers stepped in with trillions in cash to keep those giant financial firms afloat. And what of our intrepid homeowner? Millions of them did lose their jobs, got foreclosed on, lost their homes, and got accused of being irresponsible for buying a big house and taking out a big loan. This is a problem that still has not been fixed. And on that cheerful note, thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.
He's a first certified public accountant. Now, here's a quote. First sentence. The real cause of the 2008 financial crisis was the proliferation of unregulated derivatives during that time. All right. So if you look at this graph on the left, it's a little bit grainy. $15 trillion for the total U.S. money supply. $50 trillion for the world's GDP. $100 trillion for all the stocks and bonds in the world. But the derivatives market is worth $1.3 quadrillion. And this is what 1.3 quadrillion looks like. All right? It's massive. Now, there are newsletters that say financial derivatives, that's the next crash waiting to happen. So you say to yourself, wait a minute, I thought we reformed that. I thought Barack Obama fixed that. And what started the Dodd-Frank bill, something like that, to restrict the ability of banks to be engaged in these highly leveraged gambling casino kind of things. Well, there's a professor who says that's just propaganda, my friend. It is not the case. Here's William Black.
Information relevant to this debate. First is there's been a vote at the Commodities Future Trading Commission, and after a whole series of negotiations trying to reach a deal. And once more, I know it will shock you, but the big banks won, and they won big. So the context was a rule to restrict the biggest banks and how they do financial derivatives. This is to the tune of about $700 trillion in transactions.
Now, just remind us again, because this is like bigger than the global GDP, right?
This is massively bigger than the global GDP. This is so much bigger than the real economy that it now dwarfs it, but can ruin it.
So, despite the fact that we don't know a lot of the innards of this discussion, we can still make some informed judgments. For example, interest rate derivatives trading explodes to $6.5 trillion a day. I'm not sure I know what an interest rate derivative is, but I can look at a graph and I can see that interest rate trading has ballooned since 2008. It's almost tripled. We have no. Do you see any reform in that graph? None. The casino is still operating. So one bank, JP Morgan, has $51 trillion worth of derivatives. Citibank has $51 trillion. Remember, the total American economy is worth about $20 trillion. Okay, these three white guys, Citibank, JP Morgan, Goldman Sachs, they control $143 trillion worth of derivatives. Now, I don't know the right word. Control, own, manage, influence, manipulate. Maybe all of those things are true. But if you look at this graph, those three gentlemen control, manage, own, influence derivatives, amount of money that is 7.6 times larger than the entire United States economy. Those guys wield a lot of power. Think about it. So, some people say derivatives are not dangerous. I have a friend who's a stockbroker who says, Jerry, you're barking up the wrong tree. It's not dangerous. I have a friend who graduated from Cambridge in banking who says derivatives are not a danger. So I double-checked myself and I found an academic article that says, are derivatives dangerous? Just exactly what I was looking for. So let's read this sentence in blue. Several studies suggest that the sophistication of the products and the concentration of risks are potential sources of instability. Because of the increasing uncertainty, the repeated occurrence of extreme losses, and finally the greater possibility of global crisis. So that means derivatives are dangerous. Okay? Now, there's a thing called a fat thumb mistake in Wall Street. That means that you press the wrong button. This is a story that is basically kind of a fat thumb mistake. Barings Bank was a very prestigious bank in England. I think it was 178 years old. And they had a trader working for them in Indonesia named Nicholas Lesson. Nicholas made the wrong trade and lost $1.8 billion in one afternoon. And that bank was liquidated almost within a week. All the computers sold, all the employees fired. Okay, he just broke the bank. So a fat thumb derivatives mistake has been the subject of something that Paul Farrell from MarketWatch talked about. A mere 2% glitch in the global derivatives market could ignite an unthinkable financial weapon of mass destruction. This entire unregulated derivatives market is like an unsecured, unpredictable nuclear bomb in a Pakistan stockpile. It's only a matter of time. Now remember, a 2% mistake is still larger than the entire U.S. economy. Figure out 2% of 1.3 quadrillion. Okay. So here's another fellow named James Rickards, a hedge fund manager, writes an article, derivatives should be banned from financial markets. The next time some derivatives proponent says derivatives reduce risk, increase transparency, and are well hedged, stop them in their tracks and ask if they believe in tooth fairies, Easter bunnies, and leprechauns. Okay, now Warren Buffett he coined the term, derivatives are financial weapons of mass destruction. And people have said Warren Buffett changed his mind as he learned more about them. Well, I saw a video, which I'm not going to play for you right here, which was made last year. And no, Warren Buffett still thinks derivatives are dangerous. And you can see all sorts of stock market newsletters that say derivatives are a ticking time bomb ready to blow. Derivatives are 10 times the size of the global economy. They could trigger a financial meltdown. Deutsche Bank derivatives bubble suddenly imploding into a financial black hole. Derivatives bubble will cause global economic chaos. The next financial crisis will spread through derivatives. Derivatives under pressure, collapse ahead. So here's a sort of academic article which got its data from the Wall Street Journal about Deutsche Bank. Deutsche Bank, it's called Deutsche Bank Derivative Dumbness. Deutsche Bank has $45 trillion in derivatives. It's the biggest bank in Europe. They say if what Deutsche Bank goes, Europe goes. Okay? Now, they tried to map out, because Deutsche Bank has strange accounting, and they can't figure out who's got the 45 trillion. And they found by mapping out these counterparty deals and contracts that Deutsche Bank is connected to all the banks in the world, the United States, Japanese, Chinese banks. Everybody is connected through derivatives to everybody else. Now, I don't know if you know what a PE ratio is, price earnings ratio. I will explain. This I know. Stock, a company earns so much per share. Let's say it's $1 a share. Well, its price is usually 20 times larger than its earnings. So the price earnings ratio is usually 20 to 1 across most stocks in the world and in the United States. Okay? That's the average. Deutsche Bank's ratio is 518 to 1. I don't know if you can see my hand going up, but it doesn't earn anything. Its price is so inflated compared to its earnings. It's a zombie bank. Many people say it's insolvent, or they're just keeping it propped up. So, derivatives, mystery. Here's Tom Barrack, chairman of Colony Capital. He had a video on Bloomberg in April. He said, I think there's going to be a collapse in the derivatives market in April. Well, Tom was wrong. There was no collapse in the derivatives market in April. Okay, we see scary headlines and we're continuously baffled at the mystery of derivatives. Skyrocketing debt and default send major warning signs, derivatives failure uncontrollable, late May. Nothing happened. Banks scrambled to cut derivatives losses on the eve of a market reset. Late July. Nothing happened. Here's one. I never heard of a freight derivative. The availability of so-called freight derivatives may face collapse. This would mean a serious reduction in, or even a complete halt, to global freight activity. So, conclusion. Some people say derivatives are not a danger. Some people say they are a great danger. And from my journalistic immersion into this field, here's my conclusion. It seems that in an era of people not paying their rent, not paying their mortgage, not paying their car loan, companies on the verge of bankruptcy, countries on the verge of default, derivatives pose a real and present danger, but it is unseen, opaque, and hard to predict where the rupture will occur. Okay? So now we have the third peg to our house of cards. COVID is the Black Swan. Global debt plus American fragility plus derivatives chaos combined spells disaster and an implosion of the house of cards. Okay, part 2, collapse. Let's take a look at best case scenario and worst case scenario, all right? So the best case scenario, let's start optimistically. The best case scenario is the virus abates, we have a vaccine that works, people really this time return to work, people start traveling again on airplanes, markets soar, there's a huge sigh of relief, and that is what we're all hoping for. Every single one of us watching this video hopes for. That's our hope. And so we can gather in some positive evidence. Ben Bernanke was a specialist in the Great Depression. That was where he did his academic training. He said, folks, this is not the Great Depression. Thanks, Ben, we needed that. This isn't the same story as the Great Depression, says Yale economist Robert Shiller, who just happens to have a Nobel Prize in economics. We could use that one. Thank you very much. Makes us feel better. Jim Paulson, very, very highly regarded investor on Wall Street, says, this is not another Great Depression. Love to hear it. Keep it coming, guys. Here's a headline. New bull market in stocks could last 3 years and may produce another 30% in gains. Veteran strategist says that's August 31st, a couple weeks ago. Excellent. And maybe this time it really is different. See, that's a graph of the Dow Jones in 1929, and it had made a 24% increase, which people call a dead cat bounce. Well, if you look at our market, it paralleled the 1929 crash, but it completely bounced back. That we just made an absolutely brand new high, higher than the prior high as of August 27th, 2020. So maybe this time it really is different, okay? So these are all encouraging signs. But, okay, time to come back to reality a little bit, okay? Time to look at other data. Time to be objective. Let's take a look at the worst case scenario. Societal collapse, Great Depression, global Great Depression. So how close are we to a Great Depression? Well, there was 25% unemployment in the Great Depression. One of the bankers of the Federal Reserve, James Ballard, said he expected to see a 30% unemployment figure. There was a 15% decline in the Great Depression in GDP. Morgan Stanley's economists predicted a 14% drop. Goldman Sachs predicted a 24% drop. If you look at jobless claims, now they have reduced themselves, but if you look at it as an anthropologist, okay, there were a total of 53 million Americans who said they lost their livelihood in the last 6 months. That's a 17,000% increase over what existed for the years in the prior years. Something extremely traumatic happened in just 6 months. If you look at the total number of workers in the United States workforce, that means that 34% of them said they lost their livelihoods. Jim Cramer, who doesn't use these words lightly, said, on April 3rd, we may be headed for a depression. I think he's changed his mind since. The current climate feels a lot like 1929, says Gary Schilling, an economist. In June, half of global financial officers, 51%, surveyed, said they think the Dow will drop below its lowest point. Yet to come. John Hussman, economics professor, said stocks will lose 60% of their value and people have the bleakest future since the Great Depression. The Financial Times chief economist says this is the biggest crisis the world has confronted since the Second World War and the biggest economic disaster since the Great Depression of the 1930s. Nouriel Roubini, they call him Dr. Doom, very prestigious New York University professor, said this could easily lead to a greater depression. It could lead to a perfect storm that could sweep the entire global economy into a decade of despair. So let's take a look at some facts for U.S. gloom and doom. Okay. In July, 32% of Americans missed their house payments. Okay. Suicide has dramatically increased, and there's been a 65% increase in calls to the mental illness helpline. 43 million Americans are at risk of eviction in the coming months. For context, about 1 million Americans were evicted in the 2008 financial crisis, 43 times higher than that.
A month ago. Meanwhile, a federal moratorium on evictions expired Monday ahead of September 1st, when rent and mortgage payments come due for 30 million Americans left unemployed during the pandemic. Princeton University's eviction lab estimates up to 40 million people are now at risk of eviction in the coming months. Meanwhile, a new national survey finds 1 in 5 small business owners expect to close if economic conditions don't improve in the next 6 months. And a study by the Economic Policy Institute finds some 12 million Americans have lost their employer-based health insurance since the start of the pandemic.
That was August 27th, 2020.
Need to wake up here. I know it's hard because the bubble keeps going up and it seems like it can do no wrong. No, this bubble is peaking here. I've also been looking for the NASDAQ to make new highs and the S&P 500 and broader markets to only retest their highs in this really stupid bubble. I mean, for the stocks to be going to new highs in the greatest depression, downturn with the COVID-19 in history, okay, wake up.
Good.
This is an alarm. Get the hell out of the stock market.
So another statistic that was scared economists is that the GDP in the second quarter plunged 32.9%. It was never before seen in history, not even that bad in the Great Depression. 25% of hotels can't pay their mortgages.
The data shows that more and more businesses are closing shop as the pandemic drags on. The pace of closures began to slow down after peaking in April 2020, but now it's creeping back up, according to Yelp's data. Permanent business closures account for 59% of all closed businesses between March 1st and August 11th.
Okay, so that's America's portrait that Wall Street seems to be in denial of. These are facts that exist right now, and yet the markets seem to be completely ignoring that. But this talk is about the global situation. So let's take a look at global gloom and doom as well. This is a picture of the European Union's GDP. You can see in 2020, it went down further than it's gone in the last 20 years. And this is a scary one too. This is an index of imports. Countries are not importing things from other countries. It has reached a level lower than since 1980. Okay, these are dark, dark, dark numbers. Globally, 100 million jobs have been lost in the world's tourist industries. Closures of schools worldwide has impacted 94% of the world's student population. More than 1 billion students are unable to attend school. There have been 400 million jobs that have been lost globally as of July 1st, 2020. So, Chief Chris Rupke, chief economist for Union Bank, at this point it would take a miracle to keep this recession from turning into a Great Depression. Francis Donald, from Manufacturer's Life, we're facing the worst economic contraction in modern history. I believe we have a depression on our hands, says David Tice, investment officer for Ranger Active Funds. This is Time magazine. The next global depression is coming, and optimism won't slow it down. This is the thing that scared me the most. Harvard professor Kenneth Rogoff, the coronavirus could be as bad as anything we've seen in the last 150 years. All right. America is facing a second Great Depression. What Washington needs to do to keep that from happening. Barron's, a very storied investment magazine. Raoul Paul from our Goldman Sachs trader, coronavirus possibly is the biggest economic event of our lifetimes. So we certainly have assembled a great number of voices, haven't we? And we wonder, okay, all right, We don't want it to happen. We sure see a lot of experts. The next question is, well, what does a Great Depression look like? How long does it last? How long is it going to affect me, my life? How many years of my life are going to be taken from me, in a sense? Well, 20% of the population was unemployed. Suicide rose to an all-time high in the United States. 2 million men and women became traveling hobos. We call them homeless now. 273,000 people lost their homes, but we have quite a number of more homes on the docket today. Unemployment in Europe averaged 20%. Prices kept dropping. Since people had no money and no jobs, prices of goods went down and down. It's called deflation. It increased 10% a year from 1929 to 1933. People were poor and hungry. They stood in bread lines at community kitchens to get free meals. The U.S. Treasury didn't have enough money to pay government workers. Well, that's no longer a problem. We just print it digitally. Signs of recovery began in the spring of 1933, 4 years after the crash. So if we're going to repeat history, we've got 4 years to deal with this before we even see some glimmers of hope. Even upper-class middle professionals, doctors, lawyers, their incomes dropped by as much as 40%. Now, personal story, my father died about 50 years ago, but I heard stories about the Depression from him. He was a rich kid from Detroit. His father owned a big department store, and they had a mansion in Detroit, and I think he said his father owned a 1927 Packard. Well, I looked up a picture of a 1927 Packard. That's what my father's father drove. Now, my father, the rich kid, went off to the University of Michigan to study to be a doctor. And then the crash of 1929 happened, and all of his dreams just went up in smoke. His father lost his business, lost his car, lost his mansion. The family moved to San Antonio and started to sell fruit on the street. That's a picture of my father, the pre-med student, who is now selling fruit on the streets of San Antonio in 1932. Okay? So there is a period of dashed hopes and dreams, and many of us right now are experiencing that, and just the beginning of that. This also has to do with the collapse of empires, though. Here's Chris.
It is their ecology of power that when things start to go truly wrong, empires regularly unravel with unholy speed. Just a year for Portugal, 2 years for the Soviet Union, 8 years for France, 11 years for the Ottomans, 17 for Great Britain.
So some of the aftermaths of a depression are war. Remember, Hitler grows out of the ashes of the Great Depression, the rise of fascism. Hitler comes to power in the Depression. Homes fell in price 30%. Since we're printing so much money, there might be an outbreak of hyperinflation. There could be the development of a new reserve currency where the debt is monetized, in which case gold would sell for about $52,000 an ounce, silver about $2,600. So I queried 2 economists at the conclusion of this, and I said, I'm a psychologist. I don't know that much about economics. I can read it. I want to ask you a question psychologists ask. Can you rate on a scale? What's the probability of global economic collapse in the next year on a scale from 1 to 10? Well, one was stayed anonymous. A professor at NYU said 7 to 8, like a 70 to 80% chance. The other professor let me use his name, University of Utah. He said, I'd say it was a 10 with certainty. So these are people whose opinions we have to take into account, don't we? So there is an addendum to this talk at the tail end. What happens even if we do not have a collapse? I mean, put it a different way. Even if we don't have a collapse, I noticed something strange, okay? And what I noticed is this. The house of cards has not gone away. Even if the global economy does not collapse, even if there is not a Great Depression, the pre-existing conditions have not changed. This guy is still there. He is still not exercising. His smoking and drinking habits and eating habits are still there. His cholesterol has not gone down. His metabolism, his glucose scores have not gone to that yellow line, has not gone down. So I don't know if you remember, well, so the idea of reform and rehabilitation needs to be discussed, okay, for him, and he's our analogy to the United States. I don't know if you remember the comedian named Dick Gregory. He was pretty funny, but he had a side hobby. He helped extremely obese people lose weight. I don't know why he did that, but he was very effective at what he did. That was his pastime, his avocation. He would meet with a person for over 2 or 3 years and they would lose hundreds of pounds. So yes, reform and rehabilitation are necessary, and it is possible. But what has to be done for the United States? I wrote a book on this subject, and this is an update of those recommendations. For example, remember we had our 7 factors. So those 7 factors are what make that yellow line go up. It's like talking about this guy's cholesterol. So one of those factors was natural disasters. What can you do? Well, we have to deal with global warming. That's a major issue. Okay, I happen to have written a book on global warming and done a video on it, ecocide. Radical interventions are needed. We need to build out solar and wind infrastructure almost immediately. We have 7 to 10 years to bring our fossil fuel consumption down by 50%, and we haven't budged. Okay, well, there's a lot of work to be done on that front, but that will only reduce that yellow line a tiny bit. That's only one of 7 factors that keep that line up and going up. We haven't talked about the overextended empire. That was one of the ones that I skipped, but that is another factor that pushes that yellow line up. For example, if we slashed defense spending 50%, that's a lot. And that would push that yellow line down a little, maybe 10%, maybe less. Okay, it's not made up merely of that, but it is made up of this incredibly huge amount of defense spending that we engage in. For example, this is all of the countries in the world where U.S. military bases are stationed. Okay, 150 countries. We are the world's largest empire ever. We have a military base called Diego Garcia in the center of the Indian Ocean, 1,000 miles from anywhere. Okay, that is one of our bases. We have 7 military bases in Romania. Do you know where Romania is? It's cozying up to Russia. Okay, that's a picture of an air base in Romania, an American air base. Okay, so let's say that we decided to reduce our overseas bases. We have 1,000 of them, down to 200. Well, Russia has 2 outside of the old Soviet Union. I think China has 1, maybe 2. So we'd still have 198 more military bases than Russia, and 196 more than Russia and China. But I can't think of anyone who's suggesting that. But that would push that yellow line down a bit. There's another factor called the disintegrating family. How do you reduce that yellow line? And what do you do about the fact that 42% of American children are being raised by single parents? Well, the American Association of Marriage Counselors at one time recommended that marriage counseling be mandatory if you want to get a divorce. You need to have a blood test to get married. You need to get counseling for 6 weeks, say, to get a divorce. Do you realize that experts believe that 20% of divorces would be prevented if marriage counseling was mandatory? Something we could do, not very costly. What do we do about perverse and bizarre entertainment, factor 4? Well, one thing we can do is to censor the internet and the media from violence and pornography. The United States is the largest producer of pornography in the world, the largest consumer. And if you look at the studies of 12-year-olds who have been exposed to hardcore pornography, it is unbelievable. Okay, this is not good for society. So here's the media that existed before the surge. All right, before that yellow line takes off, this is the kind of media that we saw in this country. Captain Kangaroo, Mr. Rogers, okay? Very, very family oriented. And after the surge, which is the kind of media that we see today, this is what we see: violence, violence, more violence, and more violence. The 10 most scandalous scenes from HBO's teen drama. Okay.
Thus, many gruesome deaths occur, with the relatively innocent Morty even going on a killing spree of his own at one point. Man, that kid must need a lot of therapy. Nobody is safe in the madcap universe of Rick and Morty, not even Mr. Poopy Butthole.
And then, of course, for afternoon television for third graders when they come home from school, there's Jerry Springer interviewing a stripper. Okay, so you could push that down, but censoring the internet and the media is pretty big mouthful. The parasitic elite. What can be done about the parasitic elite? Well, the top 1% holds $21 trillion in assets. That's, to many people, obscene. A 20% wealth tax on the net worth of an estate would generate $4 trillion in revenue. Now, believe it or not, Donald Trump, before he was president, was asked, what do you think of a wealth tax? And he said, well, if it was 15%, I'd still have $800 million. I could live on that. He actually said that. So could they live on that. And it would bring our 1% down to the level of France and Germany and Japan and bring it within reason. But if you did that, you would eliminate all student debt. You could provide housing vouchers for all of America's homeless. You could bail out 16 bankrupt cities. You could relieve pension underfunding. And it would push that yellow line down just a bit. How about the plutocracy? Remember, the parasitic elite sends its representatives into Congress and the Senate. Well, how do you deal with that? What if you had a law that said no one can hold elective office with a net worth more than $10 million? So if you want to be a senator or congressman, you can be, but you have to divest yourself of your excess wealth until you're down to your last 10 million. So that would eliminate at least 33 members of Congress right immediately. Bye-bye Chuck Schumer, bye-bye Nancy Pelosi, bye-bye Dianne Feinstein. Now the average senator gets $174,000 a year. That's $3,600 a week. That's fine if you're representing us in our district. That should be a sufficient salary for you to function, right? So special interest contributions today represent roughly $6 million per congressperson. That's how much lobbyists spend on every congressman and senator. And now it would be illegal. It would be called what it is. It would be called bribery. You are not allowed to bribe our representatives. They work for us. It's a democracy, after all. And we would require members of Congress to actually attend Congress. So here's a person, you see them on C-SPAN, and they're talking. It would seem that they are addressing Congress, but this is what is actually happening and what Americans don't see. The room is empty, and they're broadcasting just to a camera. This is the reality of what's going on mainly today. It didn't happen in the past. Here's Bernie Sanders, a little bit younger, talking.
Today being driven off of their land are not going to win this war, nor will the children or the elders.
So that's what the American people see, but this is what actually happened.
I fear very much that what we said yesterday is that war and the enormous destructive power of our armed forces is our preferred.
So there's Bernie. We're going to make some reforms, but you might be saying at this time, wait a minute, Jerry, I do not follow. How do you go from dealing with the 1% to requiring congressmen and senators to attend Congress? I'm not following your logic. It's convoluted. And so I agree that there are quite a few steps here. So there's a famous quote from Lord Byron that I always liked, explaining metaphysics to the nation. I wish he would explain his explanation. So here's my explanation. It's a number of steps, but it's not crazy. It just seems strange. Okay, here's how the logic unfolds. This does straighten itself out, but I need to review quite a few steps for this to be as logical as I think it is. All right, so the idea is that we do not live in a democracy. We live in a plutocracy. So how do we create a democracy from what we have? So let's review the thinking. Well, first we have a coronavirus, and that leads to 7 factors in the United States that cause collapse. And one of those factors is called the parasitic elite. So what we have decided to do in our attempts to reform our patient is to impose a 20% wealth tax that cuts the top 1% down by the knees and makes it look like Japan and France and other developed countries, and instead of the excesses that we have in our country. Now, with that comes the elimination of the plutocracy, because our parasitic elite has acquired quite a few numbers of representatives in the Senate and Congress. That's unfair. And so we have said you have to have $10 million and no more to be a senator or a congressman. If you're devoted to our country and you want to be a senator, you must divest yourself of your excess wealth. Okay? And then you can be a senator. Okay? And that means that you guys can't have any outside income, no insider trading. You just live on the salary that you have been given. And by the way, as we're doing that, you can't have any special interest money, no PACs, no trips, no free tickets to the Super Bowl. You're our representatives. We don't allow that. And by the way, as long as we're at it, just like elementary school, attendance is required. You miss 10% of the sessions, you're expelled from school. Okay, you lose your seat. That's how the logic unfolds. And I don't think that's particularly illogical. I hope you follow. I hope you agree. So, we're still talking about what can be done. Let's take a look at factor number 7, debt and a debased currency. What do we do about debt? That is one of the factors that push us towards collapse. We eliminate the derivatives market entirely. We monetize the debt with precious metals. That stops money printing, by the way. And we audit and nationalize the Federal Reserve. Kennedy was thinking about it. Okay, all right. And one thing about the Federal Reserve, there are a lot of underground publications that scare the daylights out of you. The Fed's $16 trillion bailouts in 2011. Did they actually print $16 trillion in 2011? Another publication says they printed $1 trillion a day in 2020. Another publication says 19 trillion was printed in 2020. We don't know. That's Counterpunch, pretty good journal, but these things have to be vetted. We don't know that for sure. No one quite knows, but we need to find out what the Federal Reserve has been doing with our currency. So here's our patient, and if we try to make these reforms, then we say to ourselves, wait a minute, is this really possible? Come on. Aren't you being ridiculously idealistic? This is way too extreme. Who is going to support this? Massive construction of solar and wind infrastructure, cutting defense spending 50%, closing 800 military bases overseas, censoring the internet and TV. Who would support that? Maybe 1 or 2 people. Eliminating the derivatives market. Do you know anybody who wants to do that who's in Senate or Congress? Cutting CO2 emissions by 50%. Well, we have Ocasio-Cortez on that one. Couple people maybe. Eliminate multimillionaires from government. I don't know anyone who supports that. Audit the Federal Reserve. Rand Paul's father, Ron Paul, wanted to do that. No support. Okay, so no one supports these things. It's too hard. It's too impossible. It is too extreme. It is on no one's list. And there is basically no hope for this patient to reduce those 7 factors by anything more than a small margin. If you want to cut your cholesterol from 340 to 320, well, I suppose you could do that. But you need to get down to under 200 to survive, sir. So, as a psychologist, I feel helpless and discouraged. I go to my mentor, Carl Jung, for wisdom, and Jung has a very telling quote. He says, "That which you do not bring to consciousness appears in our lives as fate. That which we do not confront in ourselves, we will meet as fate." That means that if you don't do it yourself, it's going to happen to you. Okay? So this guy doesn't do what he's supposed to do to survive. He doesn't change. He doesn't stop his eating habits. But fate comes along and pushes that yellow line down. He has a heart attack and loses 70 pounds. He develops cancer and loses 120 pounds. His wife gets up and leaves him and devastates his support system. Okay? He develops some kind of disease that emaciates him. And if it doesn't kill him, his yellow line starts to be pushed back down into the normal range. That's what Jung is talking about. So the virus actually produces reforms humanity cannot enact on its own. For example, look at factories. We couldn't stop fossil fuel burning, but the virus stopped manufacturing on this planet for some time, and the air cleaned up. Automobile traffic, we couldn't even reduce mileage levels on cars, but the virus required that we stay at home and travel less, and suddenly our freeways were empty. America's fracking boom flounders because of the virus. The price of oil has dropped to even below $1 at one point, and fracking cannot survive unless oil is at least at $40 or $50 a barrel. So fracking causes methane production in the atmosphere. And if you stop fracking, you stop methane. And that's a good thing. We couldn't do it ourselves. Nitrous oxide is a greenhouse gas. How do you stop it? Can't put any sanctions on China yet, but the virus put some sanctions on China, and that's how nitrous oxide looks when manufacturing in China slows to a halt. So that's pollution in a city before the virus, and that's the pollution in the city after. Air pollution declines. What about disintegrating families? That was one of our 7 factors. COVID is actually bringing families closer together. Unexpected positive impacts of COVID-19. We're actually speaking to our friends and families more on Zoom. A survey shows 66% said the pandemic has brought them closer to their family than ever before. 77% said they enjoyed spending more time with their families. There's some contradictory data here, but still, that is encouraging. Now, what about binging and debt and spending and having car loans and all that stuff? Well, JP Morgan says credit card holders spent 40% less during the coronavirus. We reduced our consumption and we reduced our debt. Savings has increased 33% as a result of the coronavirus. The virus produces reforms humanity refuses or resists putting into effect. What about the elite 1%? Well, we couldn't do anything about it. We couldn't pass a wealth tax. No one would support a wealth tax. Well, if we can't stop Wall Street's party, the virus will stop it instead. will have a crash. They'll lose their wealth. Their homes will be foreclosed, and the yellow line will keep coming down. What about depression, austerity, and prohibition? How are you going to censor the internet? My God, there's no one who's doing that. But if you remember, during the Great Depression, there was a thing called prohibition, a kind of moral austerity. It ended at the end of the Great Depression. You could start drinking alcohol again after the Depression ended. It's just possible that a Great Depression might cause us to reflect on what kinds of material, media content, we expose our children to. Instead of deciding to reduce 1,000 overseas spaces to 200, oh, no one supports that. That decision could be forced upon us. A collapsing dollar means you can't print so much money anymore, and you just don't have enough money to support fleets that patrol the South China Sea, the Baltic Sea, the Red Sea, the Pacific Ocean, the Atlantic Ocean. All that comes to an end, and you mothball your fleets. Collapsing dollar, shrinking empire, closing overseas spaces to save money. Fate, in other words, forces reforms we failed to make on our own. That's Jung's, actually, his admonition. So, they say, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. That guy who, by the way, I can't look at that photograph. I don't know if you can. It causes me to have vertigo. So I'm going to switch out of there. But that guy, his wife has left him. He got cancer, and then he didn't die from it. He said, you know, I'm so glad I got cancer. I'm so glad my wife left me. I'm so glad I had that heart attack because I became a different person. And you hear these stories in Alcoholics Anonymous all the time. They're called transformative experiences. And you're glad that these tragedies happen to you because you've become a different, new human being. That's possible. That is a possible outcome from all of this. Now, concluding this lecture, it took, for many people, 25 years to recover from the depression. In the case of my father, he left San Antonio with my mother after selling fruit, raising a little money. They were musicians. They went to Chicago and played jobs. She put him through not the University of Michigan Med School, but Southern Illinois College of Optometry. And he became an optometrist and carved out a middle-class existence and sent his firstborn son, James, that's my brother, and his little brother, Jerry, to the University of Michigan, where they graduated. My brother graduated, I think, in 1959. So it's basically, for my father's dream to graduate from the University of Michigan, he never did, but his children did. So it's 25 years to come from that rich kid in Detroit all the way back to kind of a middle-class guy. And that was actually back in Detroit, too. Now, collectively, the society follows the same pattern. You'll see that the Dow Jones Industrials reached its prior 1929 peak in 1954. It took 25 years to recover. Okay? So my sincerest hope to you is that we can look back a year from now, September 2021, and say, Jerry, you made a couple wonderful mistakes and you were wrong. And I would be so happy to say, yes, gosh, that's nice to know. So I hope that this prognostication that we are hearing about, it just does not come to pass. I hope it for my children, for you, for everybody watching this video. And I want to thank you if you've gotten this far. This is probably the longest video I've ever made. So if you got this far, I hope you'll write to me and say, you got this far. So my wishes to you for the very best. It took 25 years for the country to come back to the level of prosperity that existed earlier. That is the cusp. That is where we stand today. Okay, we are right on the edge of this. So my sincerest hope is that what I have been talking about doesn't happen, that there are some wonderful flaws in the reasoning here that we can say, aha, that was a flaw and it never happened. And I do hope that that's the case. A year from now, September 2021, I hope we will not be in that place of the Greater Depression. Okay, that is my hope. That is my hope for you. It is hope for me, for my children, and for all of us. So thank you very, very much for watching, and I wish us all good luck.